All right, friends, we close out the judicial branch by looking at what I would argue is, on balance, perhaps the most important thing we discuss in the judicial branch. Because it's not a programmatic technical thing like how many circuit courts there are or what the various locations of the circuit courts of appeal are, that kind of trivial stuff. It's about arguably the biggest debate we have about our judicial branch, which is how much should they do their job? How should they behave? What's the proper way for them to behave? You've probably heard about this debate, even if you haven't heard it, which is a debate about the ideas of judicial restraint or judicial activism. You may have heard those phrases without actually engaging in such a debate. Well, we're going to do that today. So, we start with the term judicial restraint. So the term refers to a principle. By the way, have to say this. Unless you're talking about like the principal of a school, look at the screen. That is how you spell principle. Get it right. Everyone screws it up. If you're talking about an idea or a value, that is how it's spelled. PLE, y'all. But anyhow, the term judicial restraint refers to a principle that federal judges should only base their rulings on what is explicitly written in the Constitution. There's a video I sometimes share, sometimes don't. It's actually getting kind of old. It's on a VHS tape. I'm not lying about that. Not proud of it either. Where a conservative advocate of judicial restraint is asked to give an example of an unconstitutional law. And he said, if a state passed a law saying women can't vote, then he says something incredibly sexist like, well, I don't want to be the one to argue whether that's right or not, but it would be unconstitutional. Well, of course it would be. And when he has said, well, of course that'd be unconstitutional, he replies, of course, because legislators they know how to read. And so that is basically the principle at play here in judicial restraint. Is only when states, the Congress, local governments explicitly violate what is written in the Constitution, a plain text reading, if you will, then that's the only time the judicial branch should act. They shouldn't try to interpret or read between the lines and say, well, this is similar to the principle of, the right to regulate commerce. That's one of the more controversial ones. Now, if we take that at its word, this idea of judicial restraint, then the federal courts, quite frankly, wouldn't do very much. Because Lino Graglia, the name of that law school professor who made that comment on the video, he's not wrong. Legislators know how to read. They're probably not going to pass a law that says that the federal income tax is banned because it's permitted under the 16th Amendment. Or they're probably not going to argue that the District of Columbia doesn't get to vote for president because that was handled by the 23rd Amendment. And they're probably not going to argue that Congress can't declare war because that's handled in Article 1 of the Constitution. So you get the point, right? So judicial restraint would greatly limit the amount of cases that the federal judiciary would hear, because anything that is interpretable, anything that is debatable would go off the books, because that is not an argument about what's explicitly written in the Constitution. It becomes an argument instead about what the framers meant when they said regulate interstate commerce. A judicial restraint person would say that's not the job of the courts to try to interpret that, or to try to read between the lines of that, or to try to define that. They argue it's already been defined. So judicial restraint is a conservative, small c, conservative way of approaching the judicial branch. They shouldn't do very much. Okay? Why? Well, argument number one is a classic argument that has been in place as long as we've had a judiciary, which is that they are the only branch of our federal government that is not subject to the people in any way. Think about it. Our president, yes, we have the Electoral College, and yes, it's rather convoluted, I grant you that, but the Electoral College, every 4 years, in effect, we pick a president, as long as the system works. I had that because of all the fun we had in 2020 and 2021. As long as the system works, we have a voice in selecting our president. Obviously, the House of Representatives is directly elected by voters, and since the 17th Amendment about 120 years ago, so too, or 110 years ago, I should say, so too do we elect the U.S. Senate. But from day one, federal judges have been immune from the electoral process. They are appointed by the president, they're confirmed by the Senate. So an advocate for judicial restraint would say, look, these guys should not get involved in overruling elected branches, whether it is a Congress and a president or it's a state legislator and a governor. They shouldn't overrule those elected folks who were selected by the people unless they absolutely have to. They should exercise that power, the power of judicial review, as little as possible, because legislating should be left to those who are accountable to the public. That's the argument, okay? And so, ultimately, the logic goes, if our elected officials are pursuing laws that are questionable, unless they're blatantly questionable in the eyes of the Constitution, one of those egregious examples or plain text examples, then the voters have it. The judges shouldn't go in and to use a word that's often used by critics of judicial review, legislate from the bench by striking laws right, left, and center. They should instead back off and let the voters handle it. That's the logic. Point 2, judges are not policy specialists, which of course they're not. They are not in committees that do public policy all the time the way that our state legislators and our Congress members are. Therefore, they should be loath or reluctant to overrule laws written by people who specialize in those policy areas. In other words, this is the second argument is effectively the stay in your lane argument. You know the Constitution, but you don't know agricultural policy. So to say that this agricultural policy violates the Commerce Clause of Article 1 of the Constitution requires you to understand the policy in a way that you probably don't, so back up. Third argument is that the branches lose effectiveness if they're constantly in conflict. And the classic example here is court packing, which was, of course, all the rage in the 1930s in the eyes of Franklin Roosevelt. He gets shut down by his own Congress on that, and it never comes to be. But just the interplay between the president and the courts got very ugly during that time. And we've seen a little bit of that in recent years as well. So that's judicial restraint. Let's turn our attention now to judicial activism. So the term judicial activism refers to the belief that federal judges should use their knowledge of the Constitution to read between the lines, to interpret the document, and rule based not on the letter of the law, if you will, but on the spirit of the law. Or to put it another way, not on the plain text of the Constitution, but rather the underlying principles of the Constitution. Okay? So to put it another way, judicial activists believe that the courts should read between the lines when it's called for, interpret the Constitution to apply it to modern situations. Because, of course, the Constitution was written, we're now coming up on, it'll be pretty soon, 240 years ago. So the idea that judicial activists would argue is to keep the document relevant, it is going to need to be interpreted to modern situations that our framers could not have possibly have considered back in the 1780s. Now, if you're a believer in judicial activism, of course, this means that you think judicial review should be applied a great deal more often and far more commonly than if you were a judicial restraint person. Now, I will point out really quickly, just from an ideological perspective, that for the longest time, judicial activists tended to be liberal, and judicial restraint advocates tended to be conservative. That was the case probably, I would argue, from the 1940s all the way, probably almost into the 21st century. That has changed, and it's changed rather considerably. For example, you see conservative activist judges all over the courts, doing things like overriding certain parts of the Voting Rights Act and the in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Overruling, saying Congress overstepped their bounds 60 years ago, that is judicial activism. It's just judicial activism that is more conservative in terms of political ideology. So when we talk about activism and restraint, it doesn't, properly understanding it, it doesn't fall in a left-right spectrum. Just because it did for a very long time during the Civil Rights Movement and during, as we're going to talk about in the next unit, the movement away, the movement towards, expanding the notion of what is constitutionally permissible for those accused of crimes. And there was a whole revolution in that, in our justice system and in our federal court system from about 1950 to 1975 or so. That coming about, that was judicial activism with sort of a left-leaning political ideology. A lot of the activism we see today, including the overturning of Roe v. Wade a couple years ago in the Dobbs case, that's an example of conservative activism. So don't fall into the trap, which is easy to do when you think of the biggest cases of the 20th century. Don't fall into the trap of just automatically putting it on a liberal conservative axis. So why judicial activism? Well, whether it is conservatives today, sorry, you may hear dog toys being tossed about in the background. My dogs are going feral after dinner. Whether we're talking about conservative issues like abortion today, or we're talking about liberal issues like rights of those accused of crimes 60 years ago, the idea of judicial independence plays a heavy part in advocating for judicial activism. The argument being that judges are not subject to voters, and that's a good thing. That's true whether you are a liberal woman calling for a federal court to strike anti-abortion laws in 1973, or you're a conservative person calling for the overturning of Roe versus Wade in 2022. The argument is that doing what is right and what is constitutional should not necessarily be a show of hands. Judges are not subject to voters, and that is a good thing. I'll give you an example. It's out of the LGBT community. It happened about 20 years ago. A case called Lawrence versus Texas. So several southern states had a law which made the act of sodomy illegal. Now, sodomy is, well, let me think of the most bloodless clinical definition I can here. It is any form of sexual activity that does not result in procreation or the making of a child. Use your imagination, or better yet, please don't. All right? Now, the problem with that law was not that the law existed, it's that the law only applied if you, in those states, if you were gay. If you were straight in those states, then, to each their own, but if you were gay, you were a felon. Now, that clearly runs afoul of several various and vague statutes in the Bill of Rights, not the least of which is the concept of equal protection under the law. Courts have held now for a century that if you're going to discriminate in the law, which you can do, you have to have a compelling reason, right? Let me give you an example of what I mean by a compelling reason. There is a law called Megan's Law. It applies in most states. It might even be federal at this point. I think it's just in states, but most states have it. The nature of Megan's Law is that if a sexual offender moves into your community, you are notified that they live in your community by address. I don't think they do name, but they do address. As a warning, hey, if you have kids, you might want to have them steer clear of this neighborhood. Well, that's discriminatory. I could have a murderer living next door to me, and the state's not going to inform me of that fact. I could have an armed robber across the street. He's a cop, so I doubt that. But ultimately, state's not going to inform me of that too. Just these guys. Why? It's discriminatory. But it is a good form of discrimination because the courts have ruled it's acceptable because, unlike armed robbery and unlike murder, sex offenders have an extraordinarily high rate of something called recidivism. Recidivism is the tendency of people to commit a crime again and again and again. Believe it or not, most murders, most armed robbers, don't make a life of it. There's a reason why they do it in that moment or whatever. A little less true of robbery than murder, but definitely true of murder. Yes, you get your occasional mass murder that's just wired wrong, but most murders are one-time deals and they have a reason, okay? Sex offense is different. Those people are just wired completely wrong. So, in that law, in Megan's law, it's clearly discriminatory in that we only choose one category of crimes to inform the public about, but there is a basis for that, what we call a reasonable basis, okay? A reasonable basis for that. So what would be the reasonable basis in this Lawrence versus Texas case from 20 years ago? Lawrence, who's suing the state of Texas and the Texas Attorney General, his attorneys asked, what's the reasonable basis for saying this particular sexual act is illegal, but only if you're gay? Well, you can't answer because we think it's icky, because that's not exactly a reasonable basis. And so the courts overruled those state laws. They wouldn't have done that if they had to stand for re-election. Especially 20 years ago when public sentiment about LGBT folks and LGBT rights was way different than it is today. Okay? So, and you don't even want me to go back to 1954. I may be the bearer of bad news, but if you put integration of the races into a poll in the year 1954, integration doesn't win, guys. It doesn't. Okay? Northerners didn't know there was a problem because a lot of the North was already what we call de facto segregated. That is to say, people just lived in their own communities and didn't have a lot of cross connection with one another. And in the South, they largely didn't want it. Okay? It took a court that was not subject to the voters, that didn't have to say, oh, if we decide this, we're going to have a hell of a time getting reelected, to say, no, this is clearly wrong. This clearly violates the idea of equal protection under the law. Therefore, segregation must be ended with all deliberate speed. Second argument for judicial activism is that judges are specialists in the only thing that matters, and that's the Constitution. They are not arguing whether the policy is a good policy or a bad policy, nor are they arguing to replace it with something else, which would be legislating from the bench in the most literal sense. Oh, don't do this, do that instead. They don't do that. They just look at a legislative act, whether it's at the state, local, or federal level, and they determine, well, according to these principles of the Constitution. And I think most of us would agree that a judge is going to know the Constitution better than anybody else because they literally have to study it. It's in their job description. That they will understand the principles of the Constitution better than anybody else, which allows them, a judicial activist would argue, to read between the lines. Because who knows it better than they do? Certainly not a member of Congress who may have never taken a class on constitutional law in their life, or ever taken a class on public policy in their life. It's not a requirement. And when you think of some of the careers that people have before they go into Congress, you know that a lot of them did not have any background in public policy. So it's not like they're infallible just because they're elected. So those are the arguments. Now, as I said, one of the most fascinating things about the judicial activism versus judicial restraint debate is how the ideological part of it has crossed wires in the last 20 years. Today, if you're calling for the courts to overturn laws, you're probably a conservative. And that's because, of course, in this moment in history, as we sit here, again, I'm doing this video in the summer of 2024, the Supreme Court especially, and many of the lower courts, lean quite conservative in their ideological outlook. 50 years ago, when the courts were considerably more liberal, it was liberals who tended to be more activists because they saw a court in front of them that was favorable to their causes. And today, the converse is true. So it'll be interesting to see over the next 20, 30 years how that changes. But at base, this is an argument not about liberal versus conservative, but about how much judges should use the one vital power that they have, which is the power of judicial review. Okay, this was a short one. They won't always be this short, but key principle, get it quick, get it done, get it out, and that is what we have done. Have a wonderful morning, afternoon, evening, whatever time you may be listening to this to, and I'll see y'all down the line.